We're going to have a 15-minute, hopefully engaging and exciting conversation about why do we need meta-analyses in critical care science. So we will go over very shortly what it is, why we do it, how we do it, and connected to the previous topic and yesterday's AI topics, should we keep doing it? And we will finish with my recommendation about what to do when we go back to our hospitals tomorrow. So, medical research trajectory over the years have seen an exponential explosion in how many articles are being published in peer-reviewed journals. And each year, the number of articles that are being published annually is increasing, which means that we need a way to reasonably summarize and contextualize medical knowledge. In the past, the practitioners and the researchers and the authors were one and the same. But as methodology became more and more complicated and cumbersome, and it became economically more difficult, different domains of research and applications of research have started to shift away from each other. And we saw that the basic sciences and clinical practice have begun to be distanced from each other. But recently, new ideas like translational approach to medical science have tried to bridge this difference between the production of science and the application of science on the bedside. So of course we do research as clinical practitioners, but at what cost? Because at the end of the day we would like to help our patients at the bedside. But from the conceptualization of a research idea until the implementation of the results to the bedside, it takes sometimes decades. For example, it takes on average around 20 years for new drug development to be introduced into clinical practice. Whereas results from randomized controlled trials, if you consider actually the investigation and the conduction and the article writing and everything, it takes around 5 to 10 years until the results of a randomized controlled trial are actually implemented into clinical practice. Whereas with meta-analyses, because they are so quick and so to the point to make, we can see that the implementation of their results into the bedside is significantly quicker. So what does it look like from a researcher's point of view? As with all good research, it starts with a clinical question. And the most important thing is that after you have a clinical question, each step you follow are standardized and protocolized and universal. And finally, we end up with dissemination of results, and hopefully we can go on conferences like this and talk about our results and make practical suggestions about what to change in the bedside practice. So what does a review question look like for a meta-analysis? It all starts from the patient, which is why every clinical practitioner should keep somewhere in their head that there is an option, always an option, to make a meta-analysis. We look at our patients, and as we are looking at our patients, we need to ask ourselves very basic but very fundamental and important questions. Am I doing the best for my patient? Am I helping my patient right now? Could I have helped my patient better? Then we look at research and trials. What did other investigators find out about situations like I'm finding myself in right now? And then we move on to look at systematic reviews, because remember, there are thousands and thousands of research papers online. Not a single person has enough time to read 900 articles to figure out if I should give paracetamol to my patient or not. I'm sorry, it is simply not feasible. Then we rely on policies, either national or regional or institutional or international, and then we look at protocols to see what is the general consensus about the research question that I have. And then we repeat. And in this part, the systematic reviews, if they are found to be lacking in this specific domain, we formulate the question and generate a systematic review. And in order to formulate our question, we put it in a framework. We have interventional studies, like when we are thinking about, should I give drug A to my patient or drug B to my patient? Or we might be asking questions about exposures and risk factors. Which of my patients, and I'm sure those who have worked during COVID faced such questions all the time. Does this patient need to go on the ventilator, or that patient need to go on the ventilator? Or we can be talking about diagnosis and prognosis. Am I actually reading the situation right? Are my evaluation tools, like imaging or laboratories or biomarkers or physical examination, are they telling me the truth? How can I trust them? We can also do epidemiological studies. Is the number of highly frail people increasing in our intensive care units? Let me give you a concrete example from one of the meta-analyses that we wrote and published in Critical Care 2 years ago. Here we ask the question, given that antibiotic therapy is a double-edged sword, it is extremely helpful, it is standardized and protocolized in surviving sepsis campaign guidelines, but we all know that antibiotics are also dangerous drugs. So we asked, is there any way we can make it so that the antibiotic therapy that we are giving to the patient is shorter by duration while keeping the same safety and efficacy? So we formulated our questions with adult critically ill patients on antibiotic therapies, and we investigated the efficacy and safety of antibiotic therapy guided by procalcitonin levels. And our outcome of interest was length of antibiotic therapy followed by safety and efficacy outcomes. Now, we have the clinical question, we have the framework for our research. What is next? We protocolize our research plan so that what we are going to do is transparent, it is honest, everybody knows. And maybe more importantly, now we are reliable and we have to answer for our investigation. So there is a certain degree of confidence and also a certain degree of, let's say, responsibility to the research that we are doing. Everything is on paper, open for everyone to see. After our protocol is accepted and published, online, we go and conduct a systematic search of the literature with the help of a search key. But why do we do that? Because as you remember, if you think about critical care medicine, there are millions of articles, millions. We need to kind of specify what is the question that we are actually interested in. So, sepsis and antibiotic therapy, great. Now it's 100,000 papers. Now we need to further specify it because I'm interested in whether I should guide my patient's antibiotic therapy with PCT or not. And then by further developing the systematic search, I can find only those articles that I'm actually interested in. And finally, we systematically report what have we found from the literature. Now comes the next, the more interesting part. I'm sure you have seen many meta-analyses, so I will just go over what we have found and how it fits to the framework. So we did a data extraction from around 40 articles. Of course, for different outcomes, there were different number of papers. And in the end, we have found that there was significantly reduced duration of antibiotic therapy when you guide by procalcitonin. Excellent result. But is it enough? Because the quantitative synthesis gives us a general picture. It's not always applicable to the exact situation that I find myself in. And that's why we do sensitivity analyses. And in this case, we wanted to make sure that the results that we have found are actually comparable and applicable to different types of patients and different types of situations. So we subgrouped them by sepsis definitions. And how interesting that when we actually take a look at different types of sepsis definitions, we fail to reproduce the statistically significant benefit of PCT-guided antibiotic therapy. And then when we subgroup the randomized controlled trials based on the procalcitonin protocols they have used, we can see that both conservative and liberal procalcitonin protocols were significantly helpful. But what wasn't? When the protocol was not clearly defined. And then we looked at different patient presentations, so medical intensive care patients or post-operative patients. And here, how interesting that when the patient population is consistent, we see a consistent statistically significant benefit. But when the patient population is mixed, the statistical significance disappears. So what to do when there are more questions than answers in the literature? Now comes the qualitative synthesis part, which is about evaluating the evidence, assessing the risk of bias in the papers and the quality of evidence. So we start with the risk of bias assessment, and this will assess the risk of systematic errors from the randomized controlled trials, which we traditionally consider as the golden standard of medical science. But as you can see, even in this publication, with many randomized controlled trials, we have found that almost all of the literature that exists is at risk for bias, for systematic errors. So this sheds a shadow on the actual reality of the results we found. Then we move on to evidence level assessment, which is, in a very simple way, magnitude of effect versus quality of evidence. Or in simpler words, extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. After we do the qualitative and quantitative synthesis, we start to disseminate the findings. But bad news, they finally did a meta-analysis of all of science, and it turns out it's not significant. So what was it for? What it was for was to contextualize what has been happening in the literature, from lower quality of evidence generation to highest level of evidence generation. By meta-analyses, we are trying to figure out where reality is most likely to be found at. Because there is a convention in clinical research, the so-called evidence pyramid, where if something is coming into clinical practice guidelines, we take it as reliable. But clinical practice guidelines are made up from meta-analyses and systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials. If not, the grading of level of evidence certainty will definitely suffer. So the evidence level that is accompanying the recommendations in the clinical guidelines will be weaker than what we would prefer. Because there are also recommendations about at what stage can we recommend an intervention in a medical setting. And what is generating the highest level of recommendation is the highest level of evidence, which is again generated by systematic review of randomized controlled trials. So I hope we agree that the role of meta-analysis in clinical practice is indescribable. But let's ask a provocative question. Should we keep doing it? Because actually this is such a protocolized and such a standardized method of research that there are plenty of artificial intelligence tools that can actually do it faster than humans can. Well, the problem is AI makes mistakes. So for example, in Chicago Sun-Times and Philadelphia Inquirer, they published a list of non-existing books as a summer reading list. Now, what am I going to do when the AI is hallucinating some research, some clinical trials? Or when New York City's AI chatbot tells businesses to break the law, what am I going to do when an AI researcher is telling me to do an investigation or do an intervention that is going against actual medical knowledge? Or when during COVID, colleagues found out that the AI thought those people who were getting an X-ray taken on a prone position had COVID, regardless of whether they had COVID or not. Because the artificial intelligence learned that X-rays done on prone patients tend to give worse results, and therefore they must have more COVID. But of course, there are better examples, like when you ask Google's AI about smoking while pregnant, and it says doctors recommend smoking 2 to 3 cigarettes per day during pregnancy. So we need to be ready for the age of machines, and we have to have a sense for detecting errors. And in summary, why we need meta-analysis is because clinical practitioners need to learn clinical science by doing. And this allows them to grasp the literature and identify the gaps of knowledge in their practice. This is one of the most feasible ways of introducing clinical practitioners into clinical research, because it's both quick and clean if you do it right, and it requires minimal resources. And finally, the results of such research projects are translatable into bedside, because they can be very applicable and very generalizable as long as you have a good, proper research question. So starting from tomorrow, what do? We go back to our hospitals and we look at our patients and we encourage our colleagues to come up with questions, to ask themselves and each other questions. Are we doing the best for our patients? How do we know that we are doing the best for our patients? If we don't know what we are doing is the best, how do we figure out? Because all of this serves a single purpose: good clinical practice. And I'd like to bring your attention to the multi-society statement published in the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine about the role of clinical research in critical care medicine. Number one, clinical research, pathophysiology, and clinical experience are the three pillars that make up good clinical practice. And each field of knowledge has their strengths and weaknesses. No single source of knowledge, no single pillar is enough on its own, and no kind of knowledge is more important than the other. And this brings me to the need for a new model, which is I'm very happy to be working in a translational medicine system since 4 years, because I believe with such novel approaches of bringing clinical practice and clinical research together, we can take steps ahead and evolve and get ready for what is coming in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.